Welcome to Policy Implications. In this podcast, we dive into new research in economics and finance and ask what it means for policymakers in the real world. This season, we focus on Ukraine, the war, the economy, and the institutions that will shape the country's future. I'm your host, Olha Zadorozhna, an economist working on Ukraine and Ukrainian myself. This series is supported by the Economists for Ukraine Network and Kozminski University. Today's episode is about sanctions on Russia, oil revenues, and one of the least visible but probably most important parts of the economic war, the so-called shadow fleet. My guest today is Julien Daubanes, associate professor at the Technical University of Denmark and one of the co-authors of the paper on the price of Russian oil exports and the amassing of the shadow fleet. His research looks directly at how Russia adapts to oil sanctions over time and which sanctions actually hurt Russian profits the most. Julien, welcome to Policy Implications.
Thanks for having me.
Before we talk about the shadow fleet and the price cap, let's set the stage. So a big share of Russia's state revenue comes from oil exports. And this means sanctions, and oil sanctions in particular, are not just symbolic. They go directly to Russia's ability to finance the war in Ukraine. And your paper starts from this basic reality. Well, sanctions aim to reduce Russia's oil income, but without completely disrupting global oil markets. So why are oil exports so central to Russia's ability to finance the war in Ukraine? And why have policymakers focused so much on oil sanctions in particular?
Well, indeed, exports of fossil fuels, particularly crude oil, are essential to the Russian economy. For example, before the invasion in 2021, crude oil exports accounted for 6% of Russian GDP, and total fossil fuel exports accounted for 14% of Russian GDP. But these exports are even more important for the finance of the Russian government. Before the invasion, oil-related revenues amounted to more than 40% of Russia's federal budget, the budget that is financing the war. At the beginning of the invasion, more than 17% of that federal budget went to pay for the military cost of the Ukraine war. This is why Russia's revenue from the sale of crude oil and of related products is instrumental in supporting its government spending in the war. But there is another key reason why policymakers focused sanctions on oil exports. It is that these exports rely on so-called Western services. Let me explain. Shipping oil exports requires operational and financial services, and the Western coalitions that sanctioned Russia held a near monopoly on some of these services. For example, oil tankers need to have an insurance to access destination ports. This insurance concerns mainly the risk of oil spills, accidents that potentially cost billions of dollars besides permanent damages. Oil tankers must have an insurance from a financially reliable insurance company, and almost all these companies are based in Western countries. Therefore, oil exports were a good target for sanctions because these exports were largely dependent on services provided by the sanctioning Western coalition.
And one of key policies that your paper analyzes is not only the services and insurance provided by the Western countries, but also the oil price cap introduced by G7 and also the European Union. And this price cap is quite an unusual sanction regime because instead of banning trade completely, it allows oil to be sold, but only below a certain price. If these Western insurance and services are actually used in the shipping. So what was the oil price cap designed to achieve?
So indeed, the price cap is essentially related to these Western services. But before I go to the price cap, let me remind that it's not the only sanction that was imposed and discussed. So right after the invasion, in like early 2022, the EU, the US, and other G7 countries seized virtually all their imports of Russian oil. This is a so-called oil embargo. And on top of this embargo, since the Western coalition had a near monopoly on services essential to seaborne oil exports, sanctions aimed to penalize Russian exports by restricting these Western services. So in June 2022, the EU agreed to completely ban the use of these Western services on all Russian seaborne exports. But this sanction, like a radical one, was not implemented ultimately. Indeed, this option would have probably caused an energy crisis. This is because a complete ban of Western services would have prevented Russian oil from reaching the global oil market. Russian oil output is more than 10% of the world oil production, and this oil was needed to balance the global market. So governments backpedaled because they feared that this policy would have caused a spike in the world oil price. Note that at the time of these policy discussions, the oil price approached $140 per barrel, more than twice the current price. Very high oil prices could have caused an economic crisis, making sanctions economically unsustainable and unpopular. So here comes the price cap. The price cap is an alternative to this complete ban, an alternative actually proposed by the US. The idea of this price cap is to allow Russia to use Western services that are needed to ship its oil, provided that this oil is not sold for more than $60 per barrel. This way, Russia is not only allowed to export its oil, but is also incentivized to do so, because producing a barrel of crude oil in Russia costs significantly less than $60. Therefore, the cap's objective is to reduce Russia's revenues while preventing a surge in the oil price. The level of the cap, $60 a barrel for crude oil, was agreed by the G7, the EU, and allies. That is what I call the Western coalition. And the sanction was implemented in December 2022. Since at that time, Urals oil prices, a measure of the price for Russian exports, were above $60, Russia was earning less from sales at the cap using Western services than it would have earned otherwise. So similar price caps were imposed on transformed oil products.
But currently the cap is quite lower, right? Because eventually the sanctions were lowering the price cap, and currently I think it's around $44 per barrel. But connected to the price cap is also the concept of the shadow fleet. And for many listeners, this might sound like something from the spy movie, but it's actually a very real economic phenomenon. So could you please explain to our listeners what is the shadow fleet and how do you describe its role in Russian oil exports?
Right. So first about the level of the price cap. I'm going to come back to that later when I'm going to talk a bit about the current situation. But our analysis is an analysis of the situation like following the invasion of Ukraine. So let me now get back to your question about the shadow fleet. The price cap applies to any seaborne oil from Russia transported using Western services. So, for example, insurance services. That is, oil transported without Western services is exempt from the cap. So to take advantage of this exemption, Russia has assembled a fleet of tankers, of aging, relatively old tankers, that's the so-called shadow fleet. And this shadow fleet uses non-Western services in order to sell oil at prices above the $60 cap. Use of this fleet of tankers is typically illegal because these tankers lack a reliable insurance provider. And to do so, they adopt flags from states like Panama, Cameroon, and other states that are known for not enforcing properly insurance and safety rules. What we know about this shadow fleet is that Russia has assembled this fleet by mobilizing relatively old oil tankers, in fact, significantly older than tankers in the mainstream global tanker fleet. These tankers are in poor condition, which makes them vulnerable to catastrophic oil spills. So besides sanctions, there is a strong case for targeting this fleet. It is that the risk of catastrophe is high, and this fleet is not well insured against this huge risk. This fleet has been used mostly to export oil towards non-coalition countries, that are countries that rejected the price cap sanctions, that refused to apply the sanction, mainly China and India, which increased their demands for Russian exports. The Shadow Fleet uses the Black Sea, Pacific routes, but also the Baltic Sea. As far as sanctions are concerned, this fleet is merely a capacity to evade the price cap sanction. It allows Russia to obtain higher prices than the price cap of $60. In fact, the price cap, along with the Shadow Fleet, these two elements together, mean that Russia exports through two channels. On the one hand, it exports some oil at the $60 cap using Western services. It also exports some oil via the Shadow Fleet at the world price minus some discount. This discount on fleet sales is partly due to Western countries' embargo, which requires that Russia exports through longer routes than it would have taken otherwise.
Right. And one of the most interesting contributions of your paper is that it looks at sanctions dynamically, because it studies not just what happens today as a result of sanctions, but also it looks at how Russia adapts to the sanctions over time. And your results suggest that some sanctions that look very tough on paper may actually reduce Russia's profits less in the long run. Could you please explain that? Like, why is this happening?
So before talking about the dynamic effects, let me try to give you like a more basic illustration of why tougher sanctions may sometimes be less effective. But first, I would like to avoid any misunderstanding. I should be very clear that the primary result of our paper is that the $60 price cap has largely reduced Russian profits by about 25% in total, despite the shadow fleet that Russia mobilized before and after the implementation of the sanction. So that being said, indeed, our analysis suggests that intentions are not sufficient to make sanctions more effective. That is, that some sanctions look tougher, but may in fact benefit the targeted country, and this is due to the shadow fleet. Let me take an example. Many, including Ukrainian officials, have argued that the initial level of the cap, $60, was too high. It was claimed that the cap level should be lowered closer to the cost of producing oil in Russia so as to reduce Russian profits. Our analysis suggests that this might not be the case. For example, we ask what would have been Russian profits if the cap had been lower, say $50 per barrel instead of $60. And we find that this lower cap would have resulted in slightly larger profits from Russia, slightly. That is, the sanction would have been slightly less effective if the cap had been lower. The logic goes as follows. If the cap had been lower, Russia would have sold less at the cap, and its exports would have been smaller. On the one hand, the revenue from cap sales would have been lower. That's the direct effect. But there is a countervailing effect that is typically overlooked. Since Russian exports fall when the price cap is lowered, the world oil price rises, and this raises the revenue from shadow fleet sales. Because these two effects work in opposite direction, like the loss in revenues of capped fleets and the increase in revenues from sales through the shadow fleet, the net effect on total Russian profits from a lower cap is ambiguous. But we find that as long as the shadow fleet is sufficiently large, as it was, according to our calculation, as it was when the price cap was implemented late 2022, the second effect dominates. That is, that Russia would have slightly benefited from a lower cap.
According to your analysis, what happens when the cap is set very low, and how does Russia respond over time to these?
So if the cap level was set at a very low level, for example, $30 per barrel instead of 60, then Russia would not have used Western services at all. That is, this very low cap would have been equivalent to a complete ban. Russia would have exported oil only via its shadow fleet.
Okay, so is it fair to say that focusing only on the cap level actually misses this dynamic story about adaptation and evasion?
So indeed, for example, in the case of a complete ban of Western services, that's like an extreme case in which like the cap is very low or Western services are completely banned, then Russia would have to rely only on the shadow fleet. And this would have led Russia to invest more in its development, in the expansion of the shadow fleet, accelerating the expansion of the evasion capacity. So that's an effect we would like to take into account. The novelty of our analysis is to consider that the expansion of the Russian shadow fleet is the result of investment over time, an aspect that other studies have overlooked. That feature allows us to take into account that policies have immediate effects, so for given size of the shadow fleet, but also future effects, because Russia responds to policies by accelerating or not its efforts to evade the sanctions. For example, a low cap might have both slightly increased Russia's profits in the short run, as already explained, but additionally, a low cap would have prompted Russia to spend more in its shadow fleet. This would have made sanctions less impactful in the long run.
And if lowering the cap further is not always the most effective lever, then the obvious question, what is? And based on your model and your evidence, which types of policies are the most effective at reducing Russia's oil profits?
So again, I should insist that our primary finding is that the $60 price cap or any cap set at a lower level reduce Russian profits by around 25%, that is by more than $100 billion in total over time. Lower caps or even like a complete service ban impact Russia slightly less, but each sanction reduces Russia's total profits by approximately the same amount. So all of these sanctions, as soon as the cap is binding, all of these sanctions are largely effective according to our analysis. Again, lower caps or a complete service ban impact Russia slightly less, but each sanction reduces Russia's total profit by approximately the same amount. What drives this result is the induced effect on the world price of oil. Again, in a nutshell, a lower price cap causes direct losses, but increases the global price, thus revenues from the shadow fleet exports. Higher prices would have also hurt consumers by raising the price of gasoline and other oil products, which means that the price cap was effective, but not only because it reduced Russian profits. Its other advantage is that it did so while hurting consumers significantly less. Another parameter of sanction effectiveness, is the timing of the sanction. We examine the effect of a $60 price cap and the accompanying embargo, assuming that it were imposed immediately after the invasion in February 2022, instead of 9 months later, as it was in reality. So we compared both scenarios. The fact that it took time, actually around 9 months, to agree on and to implement on the sanctions during 2022 allowed Russia to export all its oil, its seaborne oil, at the world price, while at the same time, Russia took advantage of this delay to expand its shadow fleet. Had the sanctions instead been imposed immediately, rather than in late 2022, total Russian profits earned over time would have been around $20 billion lower, so significantly less. Therefore, in retrospect, if we could do it again, the sanctions would have been significantly more effective if there was much less lag between the formulation of the policy and the implementation of the policy, and if we had made expansion of the shadow fleet more costly for Russia.
That's actually a super important message, and I hope policymakers who are listening, they take these into account. And your paper just has this clear message that sanctions should be imposed as quickly as possible. They should not be delayed, and they are not static because Russia adapts to those sanctions via the shadow fleet or inventing something else. And to conclude, so what lessons should policymakers take from your research when designing sanctions on Russian oil in the future?
So different levels of a price cap, delayed or implemented immediately, affect Russian profits very little. But delay itself benefited Russia significantly. So this suggests that there is a benefit to devoting less time to fine-tuning the level of the cap and more to shortening the delay in imposing new sanctions. Again, if we could do it again, the sanctions would have been significantly more effective if there was much less lag before implementation of the sanction, and if we had made the expansion of the shadow fleet more costly for Russia from the outset. Besides, we should consider that sanctions that look tougher, if they increase the oil price, may benefit Russia indirectly through its shadow fleet, mitigating the effect of sanctions. In reality, any measure that tends to increase the oil price on the global market will at least, I'm talking about the producer price, so the price earned by producers. Any measure that tends to increase the oil price on the global market will at least partly compensate Russia and will prompt Russia to invest more in the fleet. This is why a key parameter of the problem is the price responsiveness of non-Russian oil producers. If, following a price spike, oil producers were very responsive at increasing supply, potential increases in the oil price would be attenuated, and therefore the shadow fleet expansion or rebuilding of the fleet would be slowed down.
Well, yeah, I do hope that policymakers are listening to this episode. Well, anyways, if you had to name one priority area for sanctions policy going forward, what would it be, in your opinion? Or what should it be?
Well, just a couple of basic things. As you hinted before, the situation is now a bit different. Our analysis assumes that the $60 cap was binding. It is binding when it is lower than the Urals oil price, a measure of the oil price at which Russia exports its oil, which is currently lower than $60. Therefore, a $60 price cap today would not be binding. This is why EU countries have adjusted their cap to make sure that it is binding. But first, the US has not adjusted its cap, so it's still $60. So the US cap is actually not binding today. And additionally, the EU should still adjust its cap for transformed products, which has not been adjusted.
Oh, that's very good. Yeah, indeed.
And
I think this is a very important point.
finally, I think that the price cap could also be extended systematically to oil products that are transformed outside Russia, but transformed from Russian crude oil. Well, I have a last-minute remark. There is maybe something else. It may seem to policymakers that sanctions and climate policies have divergent objectives. I mean, from a climate perspective, there is too much oil. And from an oil sanctions perspective, there is too little oil. But note that any decrease in consumers' demand for oil products or any climate policy reducing the profitability of oil production is an effective complement to sanctions. To sum up, all sanctions against Russia do not need to delay climate decisions. On the contrary, sanctions call for making oil production less profitable.
Exactly. Well, thank you, Julien. Today we learned that sanctions are not just about how tough they look on paper, but also how Russia adapts to sanctions over time and how shadow systems can undermine even very carefully designed policies. Julien, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
This has been Policy Implications. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and stay tuned for more conversations on Ukraine's economy, institutions, and the challenges of reconstruction. I also encourage you to donate to support Ukraine. You'll find information on trusted ways to do so in the episode description.